Wednesdays at the cabin were get wooded on the lake days. Before the dams that they put in clogged up all the waterways, the spring floods left logs on the beaches around Lake Pend Oreille. We burned wood at the cabin, and the wood by the wood box, which was by the stove, was always filled with the wood we prepared. Mm-hmm. And where we got the wood was from the driftwood on the beaches. After they put the dams in, you couldn't have logs because they couldn't go through the dams. Big mistake. Man always has a big ego. But anyhow, the burned wood at the cabin and the wood boxes by the stove was filled from the wood from those driftwood logs left on the beaches. You remember Green Bay?
Yeah.
Well, Green Bay was the main one. So, Wednesday was Get Wood Day, and it was a big preparation. A ham was baked beans were in the oven, brown bread was on top of the stove, and it was all picked up for the lunch because we were going to do work. And the work was accomplished with sawing up the driftwood logs, which were 2 to 4 feet. Mm-hmm. And they were big logs that had escaped from the log booms that they used to carry down the river. So, we had one of those, I can't remember what those saws were called, but you know that one that's hanging out in the antiques?
Yeah. That
long saw? Mm-hmm. Took 2 people to run it, and they were right from the lumberjacks used them in the woods to harvest the forestry trees. Well, there were 3 of us, my aunt and Hardy and myself. Marion was 3 or 4 years old at the time, so she was non-productive. But it was fun for her, too. Mm-hmm. And we rode over to the bay that usually had the most logs. And those logs were driftwood. They had escaped from the log booms that went down the river to the sawmills. And they were probably 2 to 4 feet in diameter. Mm. Probably conifer logs or whatever was logged in the forest. Well, 2 people handled the saw because you had to have one at each end of the saw. Mm-hmm. It was kind of a nice rhythm. And then we had taken in the boat also, besides the food, was a wind-up phonograph. One person wound the phonograph and provided the music. 2 people manned the saw. Because it was a wind-up phonograph, we took turns with who did it, and you'd get the rhythm of the saw going. And to the music on the wind-up we had everything from grand opera records to what was the current songs of the day. So anyhow, that was kind of fun. And then at noon we would stop and have the picnic dinner, the ham, the baked beans, and the brown bread. And then we probably had cookies or some kind of, didn't matter about dessert. Brown bread is kind of like dessert anyhow. And then if you got hot, because it was usually, you know how those stones are at Green Bay? Mm-hmm. Actually, we always called it Flat Rock Bay.
Yeah.
But those stones would be under the broiling sun, and they would get really hot. Have you ever walked on any of those hot? Yeah, well, they got hot.
They got really hot.
So when you got hot from all your work, you always could plunge in the lake and cool off. There wouldn't be anybody else around. So anyhow, we would saw whatever log was chosen, and some of them were as long as this room. You'd saw them into chunks to be made into firewood.
Yeah.
And to the music of the wind-up phonograph. You remember that wind-up phonograph? It was kind of scritchy records because they'd been played so often. Well, we took turns. And then we would load up the rowboat, which was a 2-oar rowboat. And when the boat was loaded with wood chunks and with whatever we'd taken over, we would row back. Unless it was a windy day and the wind was right, because Grandpa had fixed a sail at the front of the boat, but it didn't have a centerboard, so unless there was a wind and you were going the right way, you depended on the oars and row back. And then we had to carry it before they divided up the lots to make room for more people to build cabins. We had the beach, that beach down the hill down from the cabin next door.
Mm-hmm.
I think Hadleys live on the cabin next to it now.
Yeah.
Well, they didn't have a cabin there. When it was originally set up, we had that space.
Mm-hmm.
So we would unload it there, and then we had to carry it up the hill. And those steps that you walked up to go up to the cabin, Mother and Edith had laid, those big rock steps, they're still there.
Yeah.
And then Edith would split the wood, and that would be what we would burn for firewood.
Nice.
Yeah, well, that's the story.
Okay.
Pretty good one, huh?
Yeah.